All right, get ready to dig in because today we're taking a deep dive into advanced composting techniques.
I see you've provided some really interesting material here. It seems like you're ready to step up your composting game.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And our listeners have really been asking for an episode like this.
It's great that so many people are getting into composting.
Yeah, composting can seem so simple at first glance.
Right. But there's actually a whole world of fascinating techniques and processes you can explore.
Exactly. So let's imagine someone is working with massive compost piles.
Oh, wow. Yeah, like maybe they have a huge garden. Or they're part of a community garden.
Right. So what are some of the things they need to think about when they're dealing with piles, like the size of a small car?
Well, first off, good luck trying to turn that mountain of compost with a regular pitchfork.
Haha. Yeah, I can imagine.
But it's not just the physical challenge. Managing that much compost requires a different level of understanding.
So it's not as simple as just getting a bigger bin.
Nope, not at all. You have to think about temperature, aeration, and of course the brown to green ratio.
Okay, so remind me about the brown to green ratio.
Sure. So that ratio is critical for any compost pile, big or small. But with those massive piles, it's even more crucial.
Why is that? I thought that was like composting 101.
Well, a small imbalance in a small bin, it might just slow things down a bit. But in a huge pile,
What happens?
a little miscalculation could turn the whole thing into a smelly, soggy mess.
Oh, yikes. I can practically smell it now. So what's the ideal ratio we should be aiming for?
You want about 3 parts brown material for every 1 part green.
Okay, and when you say browns, what exactly do you mean?
Think dry leaves, wood chips, shredded paper, stuff like that.
Okay. And the greens?
Those are your kitchen scraps, grass clippings, fresh plant material.
Nitrogen-rich stuff.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've got the ratio down. But I'm still stuck on the image of me with a pitchfork trying to turn a mountain of compost.
Yeah, I don't think your back would thank you for that.
So is there a better way?
For big composting operations, definitely, investing in a compost turner is a total game changer.
A compost turner?
Yeah, it makes turning the piles super easy. You get proper aeration, the materials get evenly distributed, plus you save yourself a lot of back pain.
I'm sold. Now, what about temperature? Does that change when we're talking about large piles?
Absolutely. Bigger piles generate a lot more heat.
Right, because there's more microbial activity happening.
Exactly. We want that heat to help break down the materials, but it has to stay within a specific range.
What range are we talking?
Ideally between 131 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow, that's pretty hot.
It is. And that's where those long temperature probes come in handy.
Ah, okay. To monitor the core temperature of the pile.
Exactly. That way you can make adjustments if it gets too hot or too cold.
So large-scale composting is about taking those basic composting principles and amplifying them, right?
Yeah, you could say that. It's about understanding the science behind it and scaling it up. Maybe adding some extra tools and techniques.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about something I found fascinating in the material you sent. Bokashi fermentation. It sounds a little mysterious.
It definitely has a certain mystique about it.
So what makes bokashi different from regular composting?
Well, the main difference is that bokashi is anaerobic.
Anaerobic, meaning...
It happens without oxygen.
Okay. And why is that significant?
Well, it means you can compost things that would normally be a no-no in a traditional composter.
Really? Like what kind of things?
Meat and dairy, for instance.
Meat and dairy in the compost. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
I know, right? It's kind of like breaking all the rules.
So how does it actually work?
It's all about layering. You layer your kitchen waste, even those leftover chicken bones, in a sealed container. And you sprinkle each layer with something called bokashi bran.
Bokashi bran? What's that?
It's basically a mix of bran that's been inoculated with beneficial microorganisms.
And these microorganisms, they thrive in oxygen-deprived environments.
Exactly. They break down the waste and create a sort of pre-compost.
Recompost, so there's another step involved.
Right. After a few weeks in the sealed container, you need to bury this pre-compost in the soil. That's where the final decomposition happens.
Interesting. So bokashi starts without oxygen, but eventually needs some air to finish the job.
Exactly. The aerobic microbes get their turn to shine and turn that pre-compost into the rich compost we know and love.
So bokashi sounds pretty amazing. Are there any downsides?
Well, you do need a place to bury the pre-compost, so if you don't have access to a garden or some soil, it might not be the best option.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've tackled those massive compost piles and dipped our toes into the world of bokashi. Now, what about those of us who live in urban environments? You know, small apartments, limited space. Can we still compost?
Absolutely. You don't need acres of land to be a composting champion. In fact, some of the most efficient composting techniques are perfect for urban settings.
All right, I'm intrigued. Let's explore those urban composting solutions next. All right, welcome back to our deep dive on advanced composting techniques. Last time, we scaled mountains of compost and delved into the intriguing world of bokashi. Now it's time to explore how to compost, even if you live in a tiny apartment.
Right, because even if you're in an urban environment, you can still compost like a pro.
So what's our first urban composting trick?
Let's start with vermicomposting.
Vermicomposting. What exactly is that?
Basically, it's composting with worms.
Worms.
Yeah.
In my apartment.
Yeah, red wigglers, to be specific. They're like tiny little composting machines.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this.
They munch through your kitchen scraps and turn them into this incredible stuff called worm castings.
Worm castings. Is that like a fancy word for worm poop?
Well, you could say that,
Yeah.
but it's not your average waste product.
What do you mean?
Worm castings are packed with nutrients and beneficial microbes. They're like black gold for your plants.
Oh, wow. Okay, so now I understand why people get so excited about worm castings. But if I'm going to have a bin full of worms in my apartment, how do I keep them happy?
It's all about creating the right environment, a well-ventilated bin, comfortable bedding, and a steady supply of their favorite foods.
Okay, so let's break that down. What kind of bedding do worms like?
They love shredded newspaper, cardboard, or coconut coir. Something absorbent that'll keep their home nice and cozy.
Gotcha. And what about their menu? Can I just throw anything in there?
Not quite. No meat, dairy, or oily foods. Those can attract pests and create odors.
Right, of course.
Stick to fruits, vegetables, coffee grounds, eggshells, that kind of thing.
Okay, so basically a healthy plant-based diet for my worm friends.
Exactly.
So I have to admit, the thought of a bin full of worms in my living room is a little unsettling.
Yeah, I get it. It might take some getting used to.
Are there any tips to make it less, I don't know, squirmy?
The good news is that vermicomposting is pretty much odor-free if you do it right.
Really? No funky smells?
Nope. Just make sure you maintain the right balance of moisture and bedding, and you should be good to go. And trust me, once you see those worm castings working their magic on your plants, you'll forget all about the squirms.
Okay, you've convinced me. Now, earlier we were talking about how temperature is so important for those big compost piles. Does it matter for smaller systems like vermicomposting?
It's definitely less critical, but it's still something to be mindful of.
What do you mean?
Well, red wigglers, they have a preferred temperature range. Somewhere between 55 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit.
So no placing the worm bin next to the radiator or out on the freezing balcony.
Exactly.
Got it. So we've covered worms and we talked about bokashi earlier. Are there any other urban composting options?
Absolutely. There's also tumbler composting.
Ah, yes, those rotating compost bins.
Yep.
What are the advantages of using a tumbler, especially in a city?
Well, first off, they're sealed.
Ah, so no worries about pests or odors.
Right. And they make turning the compost super easy. You just give the tumbler a spin.
I like the sound of that.
And there are a lot of tumblers that are designed to be super compact, perfect for small spaces.
So tumblers seem like they take a lot of the guesswork out of composting. Are there any downsides?
The main downside is capacity. They tend to be smaller than traditional compost bins.
It's not ideal for large amounts of waste.
Right, but for someone with a smaller household or limited space, they can be a great option.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got worms, we've got bokashi, we've got tumblers. But what if someone is really tight on space? Is there any way to compost without having a bin at all?
There is. Have you heard of community composting programs?
I think so.
They're popping up everywhere. It's a great way to compost even if you don't have space for your own bin.
How do they usually work?
Well, there are different models,
Mhm.
but generally you'd collect your food scraps in a special container and drop them off at a central composting site. Some programs even offer curbside pickup.
Wow, that's convenient. So even in a big city, there's a way to connect with nature and be part of this awesome process of turning waste into a resource.
Exactly, and it's not just about individual efforts anymore.
What do you mean?
Community composting is taking things to a whole new level. These initiatives are diverting huge amounts of organic waste from landfills.
I can imagine.
And they're bringing people together, creating green spaces, and empowering communities to take charge of their waste management.
It sounds like community composting is about so much more than just composting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about community building, sharing knowledge, and creating a more sustainable future together. And these initiatives are everywhere.
Really?
Yeah, some focus on collecting food scraps from homes and businesses, while others partner with schools and restaurants to compost on a larger scale.
Do you have any examples of community composting programs that are particularly inspiring?
One that comes to mind is the Seattle Compost Co-op. They started small, just a group of neighbors who wanted to compost together.
Oh, wow.
And now they're this thriving organization that composts tons of food waste every year. And that compost goes back into community gardens and urban farms.
That's a fantastic example of how small efforts can lead to big change.
It really is. And there are so many examples like that all over the world.
So as we wrap up this part of our composting journey, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, the biggest thing to remember is that composting isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one person might not work for another.
That's a great point.
So, whether you're working with a giant compost pile, a sleek tumbler, or joining a community program, the important thing is to find a method that fits your lifestyle and your goals.
And just get out there and do it.
Exactly.
And we're back for the final part of our composting deep dive.
It's been quite a journey, from giant compost piles to worm bins and everything in between.
I know, I feel like a composting expert now. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something we mentioned earlier, the environmental benefits of composting.
Absolutely. Composting isn't just about reducing household waste and creating great soil for our gardens.
Right. There's a bigger picture here.
Exactly. Composting is actually a powerful tool in the fight against climate change.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
Uh,
How does composting help us with that?
well, think about all those food scraps and yard waste that end up in landfills.
Okay.
As that stuff decomposes without oxygen, it releases methane.
Methane. That's a potent greenhouse gas, right?
Very potent. And it contributes to global warming. But composting helps us divert that waste from landfills, so we're preventing those harmful methane emissions.
So it's like we're stopping those emissions at the source.
Exactly. And there's even more to it.
Really? What else?
Remember those amazing worm castings and that rich compost we talked about?
Oh, yeah, of course.
When you add that compost to your soil, you're helping to sequester carbon.
Sequester carbon, what does that mean?
It means you're locking carbon away in the ground where it can't contribute to climate change.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So it's not just about reducing emissions. We're actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere.
You got it. And healthy soil enriched with compost, it's also more resilient to drought and flooding.
Which is becoming more and more important as we face climate change.
Exactly.
Composting is like a climate change superhero. It's amazing how something so simple can have such a huge impact.
It really is. And it shows how small actions, when we all do them, can make a real difference. And speaking of collective action, let's talk about community composting.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about individual efforts, but community composting seems like a great way to scale things up.
Absolutely. These programs divert massive amounts of organic waste from landfills, but they also bring people together and create green spaces, especially in urban areas.
That's fantastic.
It empowers communities to take charge of their own waste management.
So it's about so much more than just composting. It's about community and sustainability.
Exactly. And these programs come in all shapes and sizes. Some focus on collecting food scraps from homes and businesses, while others work with schools and restaurants to compost on a larger scale.
Are there any community composting programs that you find particularly inspiring?
One that comes to mind is the Seattle Compost Co-op. They started as just a small group of neighbors who wanted to compost together.
That's so cool.
I know, right? And now they're this thriving organization that composts tons of food waste every year.
Yeah.
And that compost goes to community gardens and urban farms.
It's a great example of how grassroots efforts can make a huge impact.
It really is. And there are so many other inspiring examples out there all over the world.
It's really encouraging to see so many people embracing composting.
It is.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of composting, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is that there's no one right way to compost. What works for someone else might not work for you.
That makes sense.
It's about finding the method that fits your lifestyle, your space, and your goals.
So whether it's a giant compost pile in your backyard, a sleek tumbler on your balcony, or a community composting program in your neighborhood, there's a way for everyone to get involved.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment, get your hands dirty, and have fun with it.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining us on this incredible composting adventure. We hope you're feeling inspired to give it a try and do your part in creating a healthier, more sustainable world.
Happy composting, everyone!
And that's a wrap on another deep dive. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.